to be living is to die at some point. Poetry is also the language that has to always seek for fresh ways of speaking. Yeah, definitely not a career path to choose if you want to make money. Life and death are always entwined, right? One belongs to the other. I think poetry has this remarkable capacity to sit with difficult emotions.
A lot of our anxieties in life is really based on anxiety about death.
Don't Be Caught Dead, the show bringing stories of death back to life. Here's your host, Catherine Ashton.
Today I'm speaking with Luke Fischer. Luke is a poet, philosopher and scholar of poetry. He is the author of A Gamble for My Daughter and a series of poetry collections, A Personal History of Vision and Paths of Flight, the monograph of the poet as a phenomenologist, Rilke and the New Poems, and the children's book The Blue Forest. His editorial work includes the co-edited volume of essays Rilke's Sonnets to Orpheus, Philosophical and Critical Perspectives, and a co-edited special section of the Goethe Yearbook on Goethe and environmentalism. He frequently collaborates in events with other writers, musicians, and artists, and is an honorary associate of the philosophy department at the University of Sydney. Welcome to the show, Luke.
Thank you very much, Catherine. It's a pleasure to be here and discuss these topics.
Now, Luke, I know that you collaborate and appear at various festivals because that's how we met, was at the Sydney Festival of Death and Dying last year in November, I believe it was. Tell me, how did you get started in this work?
That is giving readings and doing things at festivals and that kind of thing, is that? I mean, the Death and Dying Festival is really through a personal connection, as things often are. That's Peter Banke, the director of the festival, is a friend of mine, and we share a lot of overlapping interests in poetry, more specifically, the German language poetry tradition, and philosophy too, continental or European philosophy of the last few hundred years. And so Peter invited me first to that festival several years ago, and then invited me back again at this last festival. And so I ran this workshop on the consolation of poetry, I called it, and how poetry can, in a way, bring us into a more mindful relationship to death and grief and such difficult matters. But I generally like to collaborate with musicians in particular, and for many years, or quite a number of years, ran what I called a poetry and music salon. And I keep doing that, where I invite poets to give readings and musicians to perform. And that happened a lot in places where I lived, mostly in Bondi, when I lived in an apartment in Bondi with my wife, Darlene Nassar. But I've done public events like that too, collaborated with the wonderful environmental artist Janet Lawrence. We did a session, for example, on poetry and trees at the Museum of Contemporary Art when she had a retrospective. But I like bringing different art forms together, and particularly poetry and music enrich one another, I find. I mean, obviously they both have to do with listening and sound, but you kind of listen to them in a different way, which I find that they complement one another well.
And how did you, I suppose, before you started collaborating with other artists, and how did you start? Have you always been interested in poetry since you were a child, or?
Yeah, my interest in poetry started quite early. It's always hard to say exactly when it began. Is it, a poem I wrote in primary school that my mother probably has somewhere in a box, or did it start much later? But definitely as a teenager, studying the British Romantic poets and other poets. I remember, a couple of other friends being into poetry too and reciting poems out loud. And in my mid-teens, I would say, I started writing poetry, and at least in a more serious way. And by my late teens, I was quite serious about writing poetry.
And tell me, how do you, when you realise that this is something that you want to pursue and this is something that you're obviously quite passionate about, how was that journey for you? How did that then transition into being a full-time poet and philosopher? Like, that is not a career path that they normally sit down and tell you about.
Yeah, definitely not a career path to choose if you want to make money either. Just in case anyone, wants to get into poetry as a lucrative endeavor. So I got into philosophy, or kind of big philosophical questions, and thinking about them as a teenager too. And the time came for me to go to university. Well, I studied various things. I did a Bachelor of Arts degree, and in the first year, like many students, I was exploring different things. But yeah, I majored in English and philosophy, and I did more philosophy than anything else. And then I ended up doing a PhD in philosophy. But through that time, I always had a sense that literature, but poetry more specifically, because that's been my passion, is inherently philosophical, and that philosophy can benefit from poetry or giving more attention to poetry. So that ran through my studies, and I wrote a very unconventional doctoral thesis that was focused on the poet. It wasn't my first choice of subject, but that's what I ended up writing on, this German language poet born in Prague, modernist poet Rainer Maria Rilke, and interpreting his work from a philosophical point of view, from a phenomenological point of view, to use that tongue twister of a word. So yeah, but I was in a philosophy department. I was doing research in Germany during my doctorate and lived there for a couple of years, improving my German well enough to decipher a difficult poet in a foreign language and so on.
That is quite the challenge you set for yourself.
Yes, at the time it was quite ambitious, but yeah, the more you apply yourself to a language, of course, the better you get at understanding and interpreting it, and definitely living in the context of another language helps a lot, of course, when your day-to-day interactions are in German.
Does that make you appreciate the words that you're actually either developing or also reviewing because you are actually looking at it from another language perspective?
Do you mean when I'm looking at German poetry in particular, or more generally in my way of going about thinking about poetry? Or
Both ways, really. Like they say that when someone learns another language, it really breaks it down and
Mm,
exposes them to a
mm,
wider array of
mm,
things. Have you
mm.
found that in the work that you've done?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, translation, I haven't done a lot of translating, but I have done translations of academic essays as well as poems. Sometimes my monograph on Rilke, I translated all the poems that I interpret there, and similarly with the other volume on Rilke, and I've done work on another German poet, Hölderlin. And in those cases, I'm not necessarily aiming for the most poetic translation. Anyway, there are complex issues involved in how to go about translating a poem.
Yeah.
But one of the rich things about translation, which is why I mention it, is you become aware of the peculiarities of the two languages, the original language and target language of the translation. And in a way, you become aware of the untranslated in the effort to translate, or the impossibility of conveying everything from one language into another language. And in terms of philosophy, Germany has a very rich philosophical tradition in terms of modern philosophy, from, Kant all the way up to the 20th century, and perhaps today still. So it's a language in which philosophical concepts have been really worked out. And yeah, my wife knows German too, and sometimes we don't do it as much now, but sometimes when we were talking about philosophy, I'd just do it in German because somehow it felt better to do philosophy in German, clearer in a way.
Oh, that's amazing because it must be difficult, as you were saying, with the subtleties of the translation.
Mm,
Because even when you're, writing poetry, you're trying to convey emotion and a point in time or a particular view or perspective on something. So to then take that subtlety and then translate it from a language that can be sometimes quite harsh and direct, that must have
mm.
had many challenges, I'd say.
Yeah, it's a challenge for all translators. I think with poetry, it's a massive field now, studies in translation and translation theory and so on. But I think, yeah, one of the things that translators can do is to try and do something kind of equivalent in the target language and in the language of translation, but obviously you can't do something identical. You're never going to make German sound French, right? So if you're translating from French to
No.
German, let's say, like immediately, there's no way that it's going to suddenly, a quite sculptural language like German is going to sound fluid and light like French, right? So,
Yeah.
but anyway, you can try and, develop similar plays on words in the target language. Or, if it's a formal poem, this is a big question too, the question of whether to try and follow a rhyme scheme or a meter in the target language. Or B, if the poet in the original language is quite inventive with neologisms, inventing new words and things, trying to do something equivalent in the target language.
Wow, it sounds like quite a challenging, it's hard enough for me to think about writing poetry, but then you've just taken it to a whole other level with adding philosophy and other languages to it there, Luke. Now, many of your works engage with nature and metaphysics. How has that sort of shaped your perspective on mortality?
Yeah, that's a big question in a way. It has different aspects to it because I guess nature and metaphysics also touch on one another, right? So I've written, well, both poems and philosophical or theoretical work on nature and kind of philosophy of nature, but also on environmental and ecological questions. And they've fed into each other in a way. To dive into the deep end, in my most recent book of poems, A Gamble for My Daughter, the opening sequence of this long Orphic poem. And Orpheus is known, of course, for this ancient demigod whose playing of the lyre and poetry could enchant animals and other natural beings too. So there are poems related to that. But in the final part of this poem, the fifth part, there's a whole development or re-envisaging of the Orpheus myth with all the animals that have become extinct in recent times through our destructive impact as human beings on the environment. So there you're sort of dealing, extinction. Obviously, most contexts when we think about death, we think of human death, but yeah, we're dealing with this event of mass extinction at the moment, which is, the death of species and not only individual death. And of course, in nature, life and death are always entwined, right?
Mm.
One belongs to the other. To be living is to die at some point, or to carry that potential of death that will realize itself at some point in time in our lives or any living being's life. So, that's a little bit on maybe nature and the environment and death. But the reason I connect it to metaphysics is, and maybe this could be in a way related to kind of broader tradition of poetry too. I mentioned earlier that an early sort of inspiration for me was British Romantic poetry, and later I became interested in early German Romanticism, with a very sort of philosophical poets or poet philosophers. And yeah, there you have poetry that looks to nature, but also finds a kind of divine beauty in nature, or something we kind of can reach towards, something transcendent in certain experiences of the natural world. So I would say there is, to some extent, a metaphysical dimension to some of the way I write about nature, in terms of, yeah, trying to look for a kind of depth or a deeper kinds of experiences we can have in relation to other beings. Their distinctiveness, every animal and plant has its own kind of unique character, but that can also, in a way, yeah, communicate, or we can get, intuitions of kind of a spiritual meaningfulness in nature too, I think, in some encounters.
And just you were talking about Orpheus and
Mm.
the story. Could you perhaps tell us a little bit about that? Because maybe some people aren't familiar with the story of Orpheus.
Yeah, so there were many different ancient legends about Orpheus, and Orphism was actually a religion as well. So Orpheus is this, you could say, poet, musician, philosopher, theologian, spiritual teacher, and in a way is the sort of archetype of poetry and music, with close ties to Dionysus, but also Apollo, the god of poetry and music in ancient Greece. And yeah, some of the kind of well-known legends of Orpheus is that the power of his music could enchant animals and so on, as I mentioned, and that when his beloved Eurydice died, and he was, playing his music and reciting his poetry in mourning. The beauty of his music was so enchanting that even Hades and the ruler of the underworld was enchanted, and Orpheus was permitted to go into the underworld and find his beloved Eurydice, and he was given the injunction that he could take her back to the world of the living, but only if he didn't turn around. And as he is, ascending back to our world, of course, he turns around, to make sure that she's actually following him and that she's taken forever to the underworld. And I might say a bit more about another important legend about Orpheus and then get back to the way they're connected. Another important one is that he insulted the Maenads, this group of quite wild women, and legend has it that they tore him to pieces and dismembered him. But then his head and lyre float across the ocean. His head floats to a beach on Lesbos, which I actually visited. That's a whole other story. And his head continues to sing while it's dismembered. So Orpheus is this very significant figure in terms of negotiating the realms of the living and the dead, and also the place of art and poetry in relation to the dead, because he's able to travel to the underworld while he's still alive, because even in death his poetry continues to resound. And there's also records, of an Orphic oracle on I actually visited the cave where some archaeologists think there was an Orphic oracle in antiquity, which is obviously also, connecting to the dead. So it's a very rich myth. And Rilke is one of the poets to be most influential in his treatment of these themes, to get back to Rilke. Hence my book on the sonnets to Orpheus deal with all these themes too. Yeah.
And were you writing that when you travelled to Lesbos?
The Sonnets to Orpheus book, or?
Yeah.
So that's a book I edited. I co-edited with Hannah Eldridge, who's a Germanist in the States. So we invited other people to contribute essays, but I also co-authored the introduction and my own essay, which is quite relevant. So my essay is called Beyond Existentialism, the Orphic Unity of Life and Death. And the cover has this image of Orpheus enchanting the animals.
Yeah, and we'll definitely put links in the show notes as well.
So that I did earlier, but when I actually started, obviously Rilke's an influence, and there are other influences too. But I was on holidays with my wife and daughter when she was 1 for the first time on the island. We went to the island of Lesbos. And we did these things, we haven't done them for a while. We called them work holidays. So you go somewhere for an extended period. And we had a babysitter for a part of the day and would, write and, do research. And I started writing this sequence of my own in a gamble for my daughter called Orphic Elegy. It's a long poem and developed over, I can't remember how long it took me to write all the parts, perhaps a couple of years. But I started it there.
And tell me that process of your writing. How do you go about it, that you had this experience and you've written a poem over a few years? Like, how does that happen? Do you just sort of pick it up wherever you've got an inspiration? Like, talk me through your process, Luke.
It depends a lot on the poem. So that particular Orphic Elegy poem, it's the longest sort of continuous poem I've written. So in the published book, I mean, how many? So it's 5 parts and it goes from page 8 to page 20. So, I mean, there was something that sparked writing this poem. I actually remember I read another contemporary poet's, a poem to do with Orpheus, and I was very dissatisfied by that poem. And somehow I jotted down some ideas or sort of beginning lines for a poem. And then quite a bit later, I couldn't find those notes. I probably did end up finding them, like 7 years later when they were no longer relevant, but I couldn't find them. And then anyway, when we were on the island of Lesbos, not surprisingly, this theme was sparked. And so I started on the first poem. And it's quite a philosophical poem too. And the appeal of Orpheus, lots of poets have written about Orpheus and musicians have, composed pieces to do with Orpheus. And, the appeal is for me that you're dealing with this sort of archetype of poetry itself. So it's one of those themes that you can, explore really sort of fundamental questions, quite sort of philosophical questions, but in a poetic way about, what is poetry and, what is its significance? Yeah, the relation between life and death and art. But with that longer sequence, I mean, what happens at a certain point is, so I'd written, I think the first poem is in a way about some of the things I've mentioned, Orpheus, charming animals, and so on. And the second part of that poem is dealing with his dismemberment by the Menads and kind of going into that more destructive, violent kind of territory. And then after that, so the third poem in the sequence I didn't write after that. I wrote what became the fourth part, which is about the atrocities of the 20th century, particularly in Europe, and the revival of Orphism in various ways, or interest in Orpheus. And so the Holocaust and the Second World War and other things, not sort of directly named, but obviously implied, become this sort of dismemberment of Orpheus. Again, a kind of another dismemberment. And so I had that, and then at some point I realized, well, I have to do something with on the theme of like mass extinction and animals today, you know. So that kind of emerged in a less kind of obviously organic way, but I felt I had to. And then another point I realized I can't jump just from antiquity to the 20th century. And I was interested in the figure of Orpheus in the Renaissance, in the Italian Renaissance, because this crucial figure, Ficino, who was one of the main Neoplatonist philosophers and theologians in Florence, apparently used to sing the Orphic hymns, ancient texts of the Orphic hymns, while playing Lyra di Braccio. And this was meant to have these like important like astrological healing effects and so on. Anyway, he was important in that time. So I decided that there should be this section on the Renaissance and Renaissance philosophy and art, of course, because this played into, you know, the art of Botticelli and other significant Renaissance painters and sculptors. And we were in Germany at the time. So Dahlia, my wife, said that she was happy for me to sort of go away and do a little writing retreat. So I actually went to Florence for about 10 days.
You
That
have
was
a very
nice.
understanding wife there, Luke.
Oh, but she's an academic, so she gets invited to conferences a lot and goes off more than I do. So then, if she's been off for a while, like we actually never spend more than about 2 weeks apart from our daughter. But yeah, at different points we'd go away by ourselves to do our work. Anyway, so I wrote that. I was fortunate to write that third part in Florence while reading up on Renaissance philosophy and looking at beautiful artworks and.
Having only recently returned from Italy, I am very envious that you actually had that time in Florence. It's one place that I didn't have an opportunity to go to and would love to have. So, a lot of the time we see people, when they're dealing with grief, express that in poetry. Have you found that poetry is a good way in which to actually express those emotions? And have you seen it used well when it's used in a memorial kind of way?
Yeah, I think the connection between poetry, death, and grief is quite profound. I mean, you see this in little ways too, like the fact that people who don't usually read poems will turn to a poem when a loved one has died, or, either read it privately or in the context of a funeral. It's one of the public settings where, quite frequently a poem will be read. And, outside of those contexts and maybe weddings, there's usually a humorous poem will be read. Outside of those contexts, poetry has become quite a marginalized art form in terms of the number of readers and, number of copies published of a poetry book. There are very few poetry bestsellers, let's say. But in this context of grief and mourning and dealing with death, poetry is quite central. And I think poetry has this remarkable capacity to sit with difficult emotions, to sit with tragedy, to tarry with them in this mindful way. Whereas I think, common attitudes to death and grief and sort of in our daily lives, and this is also to do with our wider culture, is we want to sort of flee from them, pretend that if we're healthy, sort of pretend that death is somewhere over in the distance and I can just worry about it when death knocks on the door. So this is something that's intrigued me a lot about poetry. I think it's also true of another thing that we have to deal with and come to terms with is atrocities in the world and poetry. There's a lot of I think, powerful poetry that can deal with, subjects of war and genocide and so on too. So it's quite mysterious to me the way in which poetry is able to dwell with what we usually find difficult to sit with emotionally. And there's definitely something, I think, healing and therapeutic about that relationship between poetry, death, and grief, even if I don't think that the sort of main purpose of poetry is to be therapeutic. Or I think it sort of naturally has that kind of power.
What do you think the purpose of poetry is then, Luke?
That's a very easy question to answer. I'm not saying that the therapeutic aspect of poetry is insignificant, but it's important to consider how poetry works as an art form. And of course, poetry is a linguistic art. Its medium, so to speak, is words. And I think part of what differentiates poetry from philosophy, for example, is that philosophy is really the language of rationality and concepts. And, only logic is really concerned with the pure forms of thought, because otherwise we have subject matters that are outside of thought, but we have to think about them. But nevertheless, philosophy takes place in this realm of kind of pure thinking. And poetry, in contrast, I think, can incorporate some of the intellectual, in a way, content of philosophy, but it does it in a way in which its experience is more immediate, that also brings the heart into play, emotion, and the realm of affect is much stronger in poetry. So that's still kind of saying a way in which it's relevant to grief and death. But poetry is also the language that has to always seek for fresh ways of speaking and talking, in looking for new striking metaphors that draw illuminating connections between things. And I think this is part of its way of dealing with death, is that, we all experience this. I experience this because I don't feel like I'm a poet 24/7. When someone we know has lost a loved one and we feel like we should send them a message of condolence, it's hard because we often use these stock expressions and it feels like totally inadequate to the uniqueness of the person who died, the significance of this person in our
Yeah.
friends or family members' life, and so on. But poetry is this language, this kind of renovated language, or language that's always being revived through fresh metaphors and turns of phrase. And obviously there's the sonority of poetry, the sort of musicality of the language. I don't know if I've answered the question of what the purpose of poetry is, but there's some of the things that I think are distinctive about poetry in contrast to, say, other disciplines and art forms.
I find it really fascinating the way in which you describe it as renovating the language, so constantly evolving. I'd never thought of poetry as that. I understand the emotion aspect of it, and I always knew that was connection there, but the reinvention is something that's really interesting that I hadn't thought of before. So I really like that aspect that you've mentioned that.
Yeah, I think it's very important because it's also, in a certain sense, an opposite of poetry is the cliche, or metaphors that have become worn and basically become cliches themselves, and truisms and so on. Yeah, and poetry, and a lot of those expressions began as sort of actually like engaging poetry, but through being used all the time and becoming common expressions, they gradually lose that poetic force and vitality. So I think that poetry is quite important, or very important, in terms of keeping a language alive and keeping it evolving. And in a way, the life of language rather than the dying of language. A lot of people who write about metaphor in this subject do use those organic metaphors of, Paul Ricoeur, who wrote a lot, French philosopher, wrote on living metaphor, and Owen Barfield, an English philosopher whose work is very significant on this subject, also talks in those kinds of terms about sort of living poetic language is sort of language that's alive. And
One thing I think of when you're talking about this is how I recently interviewed a grief counsellor from Griefline, Brian, and he was talking about how when we are trying to and I'm probably going to paraphrase him not as eloquently as what he originally said it, but the concept of when we try and comfort people and we offer condolences, sometimes it's very easy for people to fall back into that cliche or that, that sort of very commonly used terms of, I don't want to even think about them, to be honest, because they're that bad to use. And it is a way of communicating and offering condolences and grief that really is more damaging, or can be more damaging, than actually showing just your genuine emotion and concern to that
Mm.
person who is grieving. Would you
Yeah.
agree with the thoughts that you've just mentioned then?
Yeah, I'm, not being a counselor or psychologist, it's hard for me to talk in terms of, how that plays itself out in concrete ways. But yes, I certainly think we all experience that. And I think, yeah, there's something about the irreplaceability of each individual and the way in which how our connections to people we're close with really shape our whole lives and our sense of life. And if you're using a phrase that's been used thousands of times before, it seems like kind of that you're just sort of mechanically repeating something generic. It doesn't capture anything of the uniqueness of the experience of the death of a loved one, I think, and how that matters to us. Does that make sense in
Yeah,
terms of
it
what you?
does. And certainly from a language perspective, the fact that you were talking about how, poetry is always renovating language, is that you don't want to just constantly be regurgitating what's already been said previously, because it
Yeah,
loses its impact as time goes on, and it just does
yeah.
become a cliche, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And it's something I think you see in really accomplished poets and great poets, that the language is being individually shaped in quite a profound way. And I see this in, all kinds of poems I read. There might be a couple of lines that are striking, and then phrases where you think, oh, the person's just written down the first thing that popped into their head, because this is the kind of expression that a lot of people would use in this context. And that's not to say, I mean, cliche can be used in poetry too, and it might somehow suit what you're trying to capture about something, that the subject matter at that point, or you might be using it ironically. And so it's not that there's no place for stock expressions in poetry. I mean, we that it's unavoidable as well, right? We're speaking a shared language. We can't just sort of invent our private languages. But yes, I think poetry strives towards this more distinctive way of articulating things, which also can reveal the world, ourselves, our emotions in a fresh way, and sometimes even open up completely new ways of seeing something.
And how has your work as a philosopher and academic sort of influenced your creative writing in being a poet, and specifically in relation to the theme of death?
Yeah, maybe it's two ways I'd like to answer that question. I think philosophy, traditionally addresses the really big questions, questions to do with life and death, meaning, less kind of bold metaphysics today than there used to be in philosophy, but, questions about life after death, God, and so on. So I think philosophy has this way of approaching big themes that might be also approached in religion, certainly in theology, which overlaps with philosophy importantly in important ways. And I think poetry deals with those themes too, or can. But there's a tension there as well, because you don't want a poem to sound like a philosophical essay, right? If that's what you want to do, then you write philosophy, you don't write a poem. So poems do something unique. But I think, I sort of, the place in which I write a poem is different from the sort of mindset I have to be in when I'm writing philosophy, or even considering a poem, like interpreting a poem in a scholarly essay from a philosophical point of view. But I think philosophy gives you a sense for some of these big themes in a way that can be helpful to poetry, though I don't think every poet needs to also pursue philosophy as a discipline. I think it can give orientation. And I think death is central to both poetry and philosophy, but in different ways. In the 20th century, there's a bigger, starts with Heidegger, the German philosopher. This sort of defines human existence as being towards death, and that we have to kind of have our death and mortality in view in order to live authentically and sort of make decisions in an authentic way and shape our own lives. And this is taken up by others like Sartre and so on. And yeah, so that's a case where, I've done reading, which also plays into my poetry, my understanding of poetry. My work on Rilke, essay I mentioned earlier, is partly trying to show that Rilke because he's often interpreted within this context, even though he was writing earlier than some of these philosophers. But I see a kind of more spiritual dimension in Rilke's poetry too. So it is partly about that. He's got poems directly dealing with like the way in which awareness of death and our mortality wakes us up to the meaning of our lives or what it can mean. But there's also, I think, a sense in his poetry of a kind of more spiritual connection to those who have died and a kind of inspiration even from those who have died. I mean, it's a big question how you understand that, but it's certainly a motif in his poetry.
It's interesting. Just while you were talking, it made me think that there was a book that I'm just looking at in my bookshelf that was written by Rachel and Ross Menzies, and it's called Mortals: How the Fear of Death Shaped Human Society. Have you read that book at all, Luke?
No, I haven't, but it sounds like an interesting book. Yeah, because there's something that particularly struck you in
Yeah,
that.
just that when you were talking about when in context of philosophy,
Mm,
how there were certain philosophers that thought that we needed to be aware of our death to become our authentic self or
mm,
bring out our authentic self. And from reading that book, it was saying about a lot of our anxieties in life is really based on anxiety about death. And I'd love your thoughts on that in what you've seen from a philosophical perspective in
mm,
how people could learn to live better or embrace, death. What has it
mm.
taught you about death, philosophy?
I think philosophy, has definitely taught me to think about death more clearly. And there are certain philosophers, have particularly influenced the way I think about death. But in a certain sense, I think, yeah, so it's good for sort of conceptualizing these matters. But I think poetry is probably more profound in the way it can bring us in relation to death, into a mindful relation to death. And it was something I spoke a bit about in the context of the workshop at the Death and Dying Festival. I think the way I put it there was something like psychological, like this kind of psychological integration that can happen if we learn through poetry to dwell with grief and death and these emotions. This again, refer to Rilke again, was very central to his work, that the significance of dark emotions actually shift, and rather than fleeing them, we can realize a more expansive kind of awareness, because by running from death and trying to hide from our own mortality and those of others, this division is happening inside us and closing us off to a richer sense of ourselves and our world. And, perhaps depending on your spiritual beliefs of the universe, metaphysical questions.
It's interesting because it seems that the philosophy is certainly the thinking, but
Mm.
the poetry is definitely the emotions, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's thinking in poetry too, and it depends on the poet. And there are more philosophical poets, I think, and less philosophical poets, or even poems by the same poet that are more. But I think poetry have this capacity, yeah, to integrate our affective life and intellectual life. And this was a key idea that I hold myself, but in the sort of romantic era, that was a big idea, starting with Friedrich Schiller, who was a philosopher and poet and wrote these letters on aesthetic education. So it's art more generally, including poetry. But he had this central idea that art and poetry integrate the rational and sensuous sides of human nature. So it kind of lifts like the difference between, enjoying a meal or satisfying some kind of sensuous desire and appreciating the colors in a painting. That sort of, for him, there's something almost rational about the way we behold a painting in contrast to enjoying the meal, but it involves our senses. And anyway, it's a big subject, but this idea that art integrates parts of selves that can otherwise be divided or in conflict with one another. My desires on the one hand and my ideas about what's the good is and the moral on the other, like they can be in conflict. And he thought art was this kind of integrates the person. And that was taken up by various thinkers in the Romantic era and, has shaped later philosophers and poets too. So I do think poetry, has this capacity to integrate, in a way, the emotional and the rational, and of course the imaginative.
Is it possible for you to share a poem or a passage that you feel best captures your thoughts on mortality or death?
Yes, it's always hard to choose what to read, but I think I will read this kind of quite more personal poem rather than, sort of mythological poem about Orpheus, which I would love to read as well. I mean, they're much longer, but I think it is worth mentioning that my father died when I was very young. I was a month before I turned 4. And so this death, probably is the event in my life. I don't want to say it's the most significant event in my life because that might sound a bit dark in a way, but I think that, this event, profoundly shaped me and my sense of the world and myself, and has some of my thoughts about mortality in it. And I think just like to add, I'm a father now, and the last thing I'd, wish on a child is losing a parent. But when I wrote this poem, it was also a kind of coming to terms with the way that this event had shaped me, and in a way seeing, even though, you know, I wish I could undo the event, and my life would have been quite different had this not happened, to see something positive in it too, that there's something, you know, an acceptance of, in a sense, one's fate, or at least the events of one's life. So I'll read this short poem, and it goes back into, in a way, my experience as a child. And it was quite a therapeutic poem to write, or I had something of that function.
And had you written this, Luke, as a father?
I actually wrote this before I became a father. Yeah. I'm not quite sure when I wrote the poem. So this second book of poems came out in 2017, and my daughter was born later that year, but I would have written the poem, before that.
So is this out of a personal history of vision?
This is a personal history of vision. Death. My father had vanished without warning. At the age of 4, I was shocked into the truth of life. Others, old and young, seemed unaware. They kept on living as if there were no end. Their smiles were false, like TV commercials. Darkness found a home in me. I saw the emptiness behind glossy surfaces, the vacuum seal of irony. I learned to love the pre-dawn hours. In the darkness, I found my star. In its soil sprouts a mustard seed.
That was really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that, Luke.
Thanks. Yeah, so there's this theme of, maybe I'll say a few words about it, of kind of darkness, which I think is something we experience around death, don't we? It's kind of like almost this inner darkness.
Mm.
And in a certain sense, the absence of the one who's died. And, I wrote that poem in a quite like wrestling with something in my kind of psyche, so to speak. But you can see themes coming out, although it, in a way, emerged in this quite concrete and direct way. There are, themes that I've already mentioned from philosophy, in a way, about death and authenticity and this kind of waking up through the experience of death. Waking up, in my case, I would say too early. And in the end, there's this image of the star. I don't want to overinterpret my own poems because I think other people should do that. But I will say then there's this mustard seed, which is an allusion to the parable in Matthew about the kingdom of heaven being like a mustard seed. And so in there's this kind of intimation of a connection between, at least for me, my current perspective of acceptance of death and a kind of spirituality, I would say, which, we all have different ways of responding to these things. But death does raise that ultimate question for us too about about whether, it's the end or whether it's a transition to something else. But I think also it can be this awakening to oneself as well in the way we experience death.
Luke, is there any advice that you'd give to someone who's looking to explore death and grief through creative expression?
I mean, I guess my first bit of advice would be to do it. The question, I guess, is how to do it. I might end up repeating myself a bit here, but I think to try and find that place in oneself that can really dwell with death and grief without getting swallowed up by it as well. I mean, I think some of us have experienced this too, that in dealing with grief and the process of mourning, I found it quite important with the death of loved ones to dwell in that space. But there's the danger of getting almost lured into it and swallowed up by it as well. So, but to be able to dwell with those subject matters and emotions in a calm sort of way and let the work emerge out of that space.
I liked when you said before that you're not always a poet.
Mm,
Like it's like a hat that you put on. And
mm,
it's, I think that in the very wee little bit that I've dabbled with poetry,
mm,
I find that it's a space that you can go, for me personally, where you can write freely and express freely, but it's the place that I can also come out of. So I'm not there all the time. And I
mm,
liked how you referred
mm,
to the fact
mm.
that it was almost like a hat that you put on, that, you're not a poet all the time. You're also a dad that has to take care of it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so that was something that I really resonated when you said that
Mm,
earlier for me personally.
mm.
Is there anything else that you would like to add before we finish up, Luke?
Yeah, I think maybe just in response to just what you said, thinking about it a bit more. Yeah, it's interesting with poetry because a lot of people, find out, like sometimes in like a workshop setting, like at the Death and Dying Festival, people confess that, I write poems, but, I write them in my diary and nobody else sees them and they're not meant for anybody else. And that's perfectly fine, of course, and that's, I think, a good thing that we have different ways of exploring things that matter to us. But if you're kind of writing poetry as an art form, then obviously that's also intended to be published at some point and read by others. Then the whole question of craft, of course, becomes a very big one. Poets are different with this, but some poets will edit poems, go through 100 drafts or something before they print the poem in a book for somebody to read. And that's about some of the things we've talked about, crafting the language and finding the apt metaphor and getting the sound right in the poem and these kinds of things. And yeah, I mean, I don't really have any advice there. I think it's fine and good for people to explore poetry in a private way, but it becomes something different when it's an art form and pursued as a work of art that is being shaped.
And for someone who wants to pursue that as an art form, what advice do you have to them? Like, where do they start?
I mean, there are creative writing programs around at universities. I did a little bit of study after my PhD. I just wanted to connect with other writers and get feedback on my work. So I did some study at the University of Sydney. At the time, Judith Beveridge and David Brooks were teaching to, wonderful poets. And David Brooks also a fine scholar of poetry and literature. So there are creative writing programs around, there are workshops around, but otherwise I would suggest just reading lots of poetry, and particularly by, great poets and accomplished poets, and read some of the contemporary journals, essays on poetry. Yeah. It depends what, you're looking for exactly.
So, Luke, tell me, what current projects are you working on that continue this sort of exploration between philosophy and poetry and the deep
Mm.
connections we've talked about?
Yeah, so I'm kind of at this moment in a way between projects, but the most recent project that I finished is a book called Philosophical Fragments as the Poetry of Thinking, Romanticism, and the Living Present. And this is a book of fragments that I wrote, aphorisms. Fragment is this German romantic term for basically writing very short, mostly quite short philosophical ideas. So there are around 500 fragments in this book, and then an essay on the fragment as a form of philosophy that's poetic in a way. So it's a kind of poetic form of philosophy. That's the sort of underlying idea in the book. And that book includes many reflections on the relationship between philosophy and poetry, as well as their differing relationships to death. Actually, maybe I'll read two fragments that
Yeah, that'd be great.
are on this theme, because these ones are quite short and they contrast philosophy and poetry. And yeah, they might make sense to the listeners on the basis of what we've already discussed, but I won't interpret them
Sure.
myself. So, fragment 249. Philosophy is death. Its nothingness inhabits the philosopher, stimulates wakefulness, self consciousness. Fragment 250. Death inhabits the poet too, but poetry gently arches over the sticks. I'll leave it there with that somewhat perhaps enigmatic fragment.
That was fantastic. Thanks for sharing that, Luke.
My pleasure.
Well, I can't thank you enough for sharing your time with us today, Luke. I really love that you've given me a bit of an insight to your creative world, and I really appreciate you being with us here.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I've enjoyed it, and thank you for the stimulating questions and conversation.
Don't be caught dead forgetting to subscribe. And here are some more videos we know you'll love.